In my work on self-compassion, I often talk about its two main forms, tender and fierce. Tender self-compassion is the accepting, gentle, nurturing energy of self-compassion. And it relates to acceptance of the present moment, even though it's difficult, and also acceptance of ourselves as intrinsically worthy humans. Fierce self-compassion, on the other hand, refers to the action, powerful side of self-compassion that actually wants to relieve suffering by protecting ourselves, drawing boundaries, saying no, or maybe motivating a change. And the two correspond to the yin and yang principle discussed in Chinese philosophy, with tenderness being more yin and fierceness being more yang. And as I talk about in Chinese philosophy, it's very important that the yin and yang principles be balanced and integrated if we want to be whole and healthy. And what happens if we're too much about tenderness and acceptance without maybe taking action when needed is that we can become complacent, right? Maybe we don't stand up for ourselves when we need to and we're just too nice. On the other hand, if we're too fierce without having any tenderness, well, then our fierceness can start to have a harsh edge or can lead to striving and, really that go-getter energy without any acceptance, which can also lead to problems. So the two need to be in balance. However, it's difficult to balance them for a lot of reasons. Sometimes just from our early family history, maybe your fierceness wasn't allowed. Maybe you weren't allowed to speak up in your family of origin. Or maybe when you were too tender, right, that was ridiculed. And of course, gender role socialization plays a role here. It's different, but in general, girls, people who are raised as girls are allowed to be tender and sweet, but people don't like it as much when they get too fierce or, God forbid, angry. And for boys, they can be, again, maybe even bullied if they're too tender or sensitive. So there are a lot of factors working against the integration of fierce and tender self-compassion, which is why we have to do it a little bit explicitly. In other words, if you notice that maybe you need a little more tenderness in how you're relating to a situation, a difficult situation, you may need to call up the tenderness to balance the fierceness, or vice versa. And when they come together, when tenderness and fierceness are both present, it creates a type of caring force. In other words, there's power, there's force there, but it's caring, it comes from love. There's also an intrinsic sense of warmth embedded in that energy. And so one of the ways to balance yin and yang energy, or fierce and tender self-compassion, is with the practice I developed called breathing yin and yang. And basically the idea is you use the breath, which naturally has two parts to it, in and out, as a metaphor for tender and fierce self-compassion. Typically on the in-breath, you imagine fierce self-compassion flowing in you, right? So the in-breath is often more energizing as you're bringing oxygen in, so you can imagine this fierce energy going up your spine, filling your body. And then the out-breath is the relaxation, the letting go, which is more of the accepting, tender energy. And so you can practice integrating both energies in your body first at the level of, kind of somatic bodily awareness. Right before you maybe have to take some action, or you need to make sure you can be both fierce and tender. Because caring force is always more effective than just care alone with no back to it, no backbone, or just a force without any warmth to it. So I hope you try this practice. Because for me, it's really made a big difference in my ability to integrate my fierce and tender sides. Thank you.